Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're honored to have a very special guest with us here on the podcast, Dr. David Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is the Assistant Professor of American History at Wingate University. He is also the Director of Race and Ethnic Studies there at the university. He holds a PhD in American History from Auburn University, and he specializes in the history of the 19th and 20th century U.S. South. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Mitchell.
Thanks a lot.
And today we're going to be talking about a subject that I think over the past few years has been on everybody's mind to some degree or another. That is a pandemic and how that pandemic impacts a local community. And in this case, we're going back to 1918 and looking at the Spanish flu and how it impacted Monroe, North Carolina, which is sort of south. For those who don't know, it's sort of southeast of Charlotte, correct?
That's correct. It's on the way to the beach.
Yeah, on the way to the beach. Absolutely. So Dr. Mitchell, I think we'll start with what first got you interested in this particular topic?
So it's really kind of a funny story. Back in 2019, had a friend of mine who asked me to give a speech at the Union County Historical Society. Monroe was celebrating its 175th anniversary. And so a lot of what I do and the research that I do has to do with religion in the American South. And so they asked me to speak on churches, but didn't really give me any guide. They just said something on churches. So, as we kind of do, you got to find some sort of a starting point. So just kind of arbitrarily, I said, you know what, I'm going to go back 100 years and just try to figure out what kind of things churches were doing in 1919. Didn't have any other agenda besides just got to find a starting point. And obviously, I expected to find a great deal on World War I. I expected to find the beginnings of the 1920s and, conflicts in culture between secular and, religious issues. I expected to find a whole lot about alcohol because we're getting ready to have nationwide prohibition. And so I expected to see a lot of these types of things. What I did not expect to see was a community that was in calamitous circumstances over a flu pandemic that I remembered, obviously, or that I knew about, but I just didn't put anything together. This turned out to be kind of it wasn't a throwaway line, but a throwaway couple of paragraphs, that I included in this speech about other things. But a couple months later, obviously, I gave the speech in November of 2019, and then a couple of months later, the COVID pandemic hit, and so like other historians, I went back and started looking at some of that stuff, and just out of curiosity, and didn't really do a whole lot with it. But just kind of tucked it away and thought to myself, this would be maybe an interesting thing to go back and look at a later time. And so in the recent past, I went back and, I wanted to look not just at the 1918 year, but I wanted to pull it a little bit further and look at how the pandemic affected a community over a number of years. We're several years removed from the worst of the COVID pandemic, and I think obviously they've talked about saying, well, the pandemic part is now over, and where do we go from here? And I think that many of us have over the last couple of years kind of learned to live with COVID. And I wanted to see what type of kind of long-term, what was the long-term, I guess consequences of this Spanish flu pandemic as well.
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, Dr. Mitchell, I think it's interesting how you kind of found your way to that particular topic right at that particular time. I'm curious to know speaking of Monroe, because we want to look at, how it really affected a small community. Ray and I are both in a small community also. And usually when there are crises or when things, like that come about, everybody looks at the big picture. But looking at Monroe and these other smaller communities, how did the 1918 pandemic affect Monroe economically, socially, and politically?
Well, I think first of all, people, when the flu hit, people had no idea really it was coming. Obviously, like a lot of communities in North Carolina, it was not really affected by the spring pandemic that that a lot of that some of the Army bases and so forth were affected. It was really the end of September into early October when Monroe got hit, and people were simply overwhelmed, and we're looking for ways to deal with this. People had not experienced the type of dramatic sickness that hit very, very quickly. People complained about high fevers, chills, their bones ached. They bled from everything. They coughed up bled from their nostrils, ears, even their eyes at some points. So it was really kind of devastating, not just physically, but psychologically and emotionally to the community. Obviously, Monroe was not equipped to deal with this. There was no health department in the city of Monroe, for instance. They complained for years. Many of the city leaders had complained for years that the city needed some sort of a health department because if you wanted to be a progressive Southern city that attracted businesses and so forth, a health department was a sign that you were a progressive town. And this is one thing that happened. So one of the things that happened at the very beginning is Monroe started canvassing its neighborhoods twice a week to count the number of people who were sick. They set up in an old drugstore that was empty at the time, and started counting. Basically, it was the beginning of contact tracing, and and obviously. After that, it created kind of a permanent health department for the city. People pitched in. One of the things that I found really interesting was the way that people kind of pitched in. Dr. John Belk, who was one of the Belk brothers, basically loaned out his delivery truck to deliver food. Community leaders kind of pitched in to provide soup and so forth to people. Neighborhood individual neighbors would, when a family got sick, they would separate, particularly if a family had children. One of the things they did, they separated the husband and wife to try to make sure that the entire family didn't get sick, and children wound up without either parents, which was the case in a couple of situations. So, I mean, there were all kinds of things like that, that had these, that pulled the community together. But, let's face it, the entire community had to shut down in October. Schools shut down, businesses shut down, churches shut down. One of the difficulty was in trying to keep these things shut down. People got impatient with the shutdown, as you can probably imagine. But we're not talking about 6 months to a year. We're talking about they got impatient within a month or two. So people were looking for ways to kind of skirt around the quarantines and so forth, and do what they had to do, because businesses, there wasn't a whole lot of relief funds available for those type of things. So
if you owned a business, it was sitting there idle and you weren't making money. Going back to Dr. John Belk, and you said they didn't have a health department within Monroe. What kind of health services did they have for people? I mean, was it did they have, I know they probably didn't have a hospital, but did they have doctors' offices or something that could maybe
Yeah,
help
I mean,
people?
there were certainly doctors' offices, but because the flu came on so quick. Well, I'll just give you a statistic. Charlotte reported its first case on Monday, September the 30th, and by Friday, 140 people were reported. The doctors reported 140 people were ill. Monroe had the same type of a situation. I don't have the numbers, but they, basically doctors were overwhelmed with patients trying to seek answers. They were desperate. You can read it kind of in the language of the newspapers. They experimented with all kinds of drugs and so forth to try to relieve the pain. They use things, obviously they use diuretics and so forth, things that were used to treat malaria, they were using to purge the body of disease and so forth. They even resorted, here's a funny story, but state of North Carolina resorted to trying to treat the flu with confiscated whiskey. So, during the time of Prohibition, obviously you couldn't purchase alcohol off the shelf, and so there would obviously you had to get a pharmacist, or there were still obviously there were still all kinds of drugs that had alcohol in it, but you couldn't just get straight alcohol or whiskey or something like that. And one of the things that they did was, there was an officer who essentially was, as he was confiscating the whiskey, he was passing it out to doctors and so forth to help them treat the flu. I don't think it helped very often, and he got in some trouble within the state as newspapers started reporting on it. But anyway, it just kind of shows how desperate people were to try to find some sort of a solution to that.
Yeah, anything. And I imagine that may have helped some people feel a little better, even if it didn't help their sickness.
It did. And the other thing is there were a lot of quacks. Basically, there were a whole lot of quacks that were basically promising that they had cracked the flu epidemic, and there were opportunities to make a lot of money, in a local community, preying on people who were desperate to find some sort of a remedy. Newspapers were filled with all kinds of stories about these magical elixirs that a community next door or in another state was experimenting with, but somehow it never really made it to Monroe. So
yeah.
One of the things that I remember reading about, this pandemic, this influenza, is that it seemed to affect people who were basically really healthy compared to those who might not have been in the best of health. Is that a fair understanding of how this pandemic kind of made its way through people? Was it more geared towards people who were in better health?
It was. So obviously, yeah, this is the one that affected 20 to 40-year-olds, young people. Pregnant women in particular were susceptible to this. But one of the things that was just heartbreaking to read is that a lot of the local newspapers in October and even November were still reporting that the flu only affected the elderly, and that young and healthy people were generally okay. And we know that you can see it in the people that were getting sick and passing away, young families, children, and so forth, who were passing away. That narrative did not line up with the obituaries and so forth that we're seeing in the papers. And I don't know when. I've not been able to pull together when they finally figured it out, and I'm not sure if in the city of Monroe, if they ever figured it out before the flu kind of dissipated. Now it came back a couple of times, but the most deadly part of it dissipated. I don't think they were ever able to put it together that it was affecting young people so badly.
And that's one of the things. I was just thinking, back in 1918, we do not have the availability of media that we have today. We do not have, so the people in Monroe were basically trying to figure this out on their own. I know that even the information that was coming from the state was very slow, and it was also very confusing because they were trying to figure this out. So you have these quacks that you mentioned, you have the newspapers, which is really just basically feeding whatever's being given to them. So it really does evolve into this crisis of community, because you have this blood coming out, as you mentioned, you have all of these symptoms that are happening, and everybody has no idea how this has come about, why it's coming about, and how to fix it. So you mentioned the sense of community that was there with people helping one another, but after the first month, when people started to kind of try to skirt things, did we start to see unrest among people because there was all of this misinformation?
Yeah, I mean, sure, you see it. People start, the longer people are involved in this pandemic, the more they begin to search for some answers, to try to make sense of this type of a tragedy. Again, newspapers, which is where I got a lot of my community information, published all kinds of things, as you can imagine. Some of them were the state level, but they also syndicated a lot of stories from national news. One of the things that I found really interesting was in December, the Monroe paper carried a couple of articles describing the flu as a Chinese plague. Or as essentially a Chinese flu, and one explanation was that essentially what was called Chinese coolies or laborers, you might even call them kind of enslaved individuals, but it brought this flu from China to Europe during the World War I, and it eventually came to the United States. Now, what a lot of people, we don't really know for sure, but one of the explanations is that flu actually originated in like Kansas, around Fort Riley, Kansas, and it was transmitted from hog farms to people. There's another explanation that it possibly got started in New York City, but generally speaking, most historians attribute it to at least this particular strain to the United States, who wound up taking it to Europe, where it morphed into a more deadly strain, and then found its way back to the United States in the fall. But yeah, there was a lot of that. And there was also some division between the rural communities and the city of Monroe as well. The health department, basically declared a quarantine in November of that. The newly formed health department declared a quarantine, and one of the first groups to kind of push for that was rural churches who wanted to continue with their corn shucking exercises, their kind of sense of community, and they were among the first to say, no, we're going to continue on in November, and for some of these communities, it actually hurt them a little bit because they went back too soon. They were a little too impatient in getting back to community and not sticking it out, and it cost them. It cost a few communities around the area because of that.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that in recent years in response to COVID-19, sort of history, not necessarily repeating itself, but coming awfully close. When we think about, the churches and the community, did people, I guess where I'm going here is, did people struggle? Was there like an uptick in like mental illness as a result of people being isolated? I know we saw that a little bit with COVID. Does that show up in any of your research?
I didn't see anything along those lines. I do know this. In the summer of 1919, I do know that there was evidence of people, basically ready to kind of break free from the reins of COVID. And one of the things that I mentioned in my presentation, and one of the things that got me started and interested in this was I found evidence of a huge July the 4th celebration in the city, where like 25,000 people came into the city of Monroe. They came from all around the different communities to celebrate the 4th of July. They gathered around the courthouse in very close quarters. They watched an airplane race. They watched a car race. They were involved in parades and so forth. So they were pretty closely confined. And I think I got the sense from the language of the newspaper that there was this kind of sense of relief and release that for the most part, people had triumphed over this flu pandemic, and that things were kind of turning back toward normal. There were a lot of signs of optimism in 1919. There were, the city promised to expand its public utilities that year. The Belk brothers decided to build a brand new department store, 2-story brick department store. There was a shortage of housing in the city. So, 1919 kind of signified that people were kind of getting back to it and recovering, but flu did not go away. It simply stayed around, and it seemed like every single time that Monroe seemed to kind of get on its feet, there was another epidemic. Nothing like the original one, but because people had in their minds that, hey, that they'd had these experiences of the past, they were constantly being reminded that it's coming back. And the language often was, officials are fearing that this is going to be much like the original epidemic. Officials are bracing for a terrible flu season in the winter of 1920 and so forth. So they certainly did. And the city did quarantine a couple of times during the 1920s because of flu outbreaks.
Now, you talk about the July 1919 celebrations. Was it an almost immediate uptick in the virus, or it didn't really come back until fall 1919?
It really didn't come back. It really did not come back until the beginning of 1920, really.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. So, I mean, there were a few cases, but there really wasn't, what we would call a significant outbreak until the winter of 1920 and, early winter of 1920. So, but that one was, it hit, and it only lasted about 4 weeks. But when it hit, it was pretty bad. So, And it affected some young people as well. One woman, I think, lost 4 children within a time span of about 6 weeks. Yeah. I mean, it came and went pretty quickly, but when it hit, it was a definite reminder that there were still deadly strains of the flu out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm kind of curious about the role that religion played during this particular period. In a few years, we start to see that there's this theological controversy in America where, you have the modernist, you have the fundamentalist, and leads to a schism. But you also have a war ending, which usually leads to some sense of revival or people drawing closer to God. And in the middle of all of that, you have this, I guess, the church deciding whether the church is free from what the state says, and church can do what they meant. You mentioned some of the rural counties still doing the corn shucking, still getting together, violating kind of whatever quarantine rules that were in place. But, where was the church during this period of the influenza? And, did they help? Did they kind of go against what the state was saying? What was their role?
So, as you can probably imagine, well, when when the offering plates are not getting passed around, there are financial ramifications for these churches. And in the fall of 1918 and into early 1919, it was pretty clear that churches took a dramatic hit. I saw a lot of constant reminders to get caught up on last year's contributions to your giving and so forth. So yeah, I mean, in the initial stage, it hurt churches, but churches made quite a comeback in 1919. They were engaged in the community. Church growth was growing in 1919. I noticed that in several cases, the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church, and the Presbyterian Church all planned to build onto their churches in the year 1919. So there were, so certainly there were, there was some forward thinking going on. I also noted that churches, even in the spring of 1919, when the pandemic was still going on and Marshville was getting hit really hard in March of the community right down the road from Monroe. Marshville was getting hammered by the flu in both February and March of 1919. But church communities were organizing, kind of charity work, relief effort. And it wasn't just a local relief effort. One of the things that I noticed was that Monroe came together to fund a charity to help Armenian Christians toward the end of a genocide in Turkey, and a lot of churches were heavily involved in sending money overseas to help out Armenians who have been dislocated during World War I and in the aftermath of that. So and this is something I came across. So there was a little tiny local community church here called the True Lights. The True Lights are there are only about 6 or 8 congregations still around to this day. The True Lights were a group who started in upstate South Carolina, and they were one of these kind of end of times, religions that kind of followed along those of William Miller and so forth. So back and I don't want to go off into too much of a tangent, but back in the 1830s and 40s, a guy named William Miller created the Seventh-day Adventist. And one of the things that, one of the ideas was that the end of the world was coming, and it was coming soon. Miller convinced a lot of his followers to sell off all their belongings and get ready for the second coming. Obviously, it never came, and what's called the Great Disappointment, because the end of times never came. But in the aftermath of that, several groups split off from the Adventist, and one of them was the True Lights. So they found their way up here to right up here in Unionville, where I live. The Rocky River True Lights is one of the largest of these True Light congregations. But a community church who is very focused on kind of like preparing for the end of times or the end of days or the second coming of Jesus and the judgment and so forth. This community church was also involved in giving money to this relief organization. When we think about these type of churches, we often think of them as being very insular, very protected, very focused on the kind of the otherworldly qualities of religion. And so to give their money and so forth during this time, I think was pretty significant. I think it symbolized the idea of hope, of a better future and so forth, and a group of people who wanted to be a part of that future. So anyway.
Yeah, and staying with that theme of end of times, were there people who sort of viewed the influenza pandemic as maybe a sign of the end or a sign of judgment?
I didn't see anything in any of the now. Most of the things that I saw, or most of the churches that I looked at, were uh, town churches.
Mhm.
Town churches tend to be middle class. They tend to have educated clergy, and they're not gonna. And many of them are not gonna reflect kind of this end of times thinking, like the True Lights or like other kind of rural communities, whether they be holiness or Pentecostal or whatever, rural community churches. I didn't get a sense of that in any of the publications, but I'm sure there probably had to be some of that. But it seemed like that the church community was tended to be pretty responsible. Now, one thing I did notice that in 1920, when the city of Monroe issued a quarantine shutting down businesses and schools, there was one exemption, and that exemption was local churches. The community decided that they didn't have the authority to shut down the churches, and they left it up to the individual churches. But every church in downtown Monroe complied with that quarantine. So they did so voluntarily, which also I think it symbolizes how closely connected they were with that community, and how much they believed that it was kind of everybody was in this together.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's absolutely fascinating, the research and the studies that you have done with this. And I guess my final question to you would be, what is a lasting legacy or something that we can take from Monroe and what they experienced that can help people today? I know we're out of a pandemic, if you will, but there's going to be another pandemic. There's going to be another crisis. There's going to be something that's going to affect the local community. So in all of your research with Monroe, what's that key thing that allowed Monroe to make it through the 1918 pandemic?
Yeah, we always, when we do history, we're always kind of looking for that payoff at the end. What's the moral to the story? I always kind of hesitate to go too far in reading into that. But I guess the one thing that struck me, and I don't know if it's applicable today, but I was really struck by how connected people were together, and how much that people kind of saw themselves as being responsible for each other. And it wasn't that, there were complaints. There were complaints about rogue businesses. There were complaints about rogue individuals who didn't take the quarantines seriously. There was some cynicism, like there always is, but to a much greater degree in the early 1900s, Monroe's community was really solid in how they responded to not only how they responded to the crisis of this community, but how they continually made decisions with the idea that this might happen again. Red Cross was a perfect example of this. The Red Cross, which started as a relief organization connected with World War I, very quickly got, one of the things that really got the Red Cross off to a good start domestically is how that they helped with local pandemic responses. By the time we get to 1922, the Red Cross in Monroe is holding kind of educational, I guess what we would call home care for the sick is what they called it, but doing kind of local educational programming to plan for future epidemics. So that's one example, but that's I guess my takeaway is just looking at the community. And when you're reading through this stuff, as we're historians, we know what's going to happen. We know what's coming, right? So you're reading through these experiences, and what the trajectory is gonna be, but you don't know how people are going to respond, right? And so you see it every week. These people are involved. Maybe one person gets sick and one person passes away, but somebody else steps in. There is this kind of, I don't know. There's this real sense of optimism in the future that people come out of this as they come out of this pandemic. Not exactly the same way that the pandemic has divided us today, right? It's just different. So, and there's just so many differences between the flu of 1918 and the COVID. COVID lasted much longer. The gestation period was much longer. And so, if you get sick, you got to get tested. You got to wait 7 days or 10 days. The flu burned through a community a lot of times in a week. People would get sick and they die within a day. So it's just, it was a different set of, it's still an epidemic, it's still a pandemic. People had to deal with it, but some of the circumstances that allowed the people in 1918 and 1919 to move on, to be able to celebrate in the summer of 1919 is because the flu just didn't last nearly as long as COVID. So, that's another thing that, as you're trying to make these comparisons, they're not exactly the same. So.
Yeah, there's not a one-to-one there.
No.
And also, I think another difference is President Woodrow Wilson. I know he was in Paris during summer, if not all of it. He never made any official statement on the flu, did he?
No, he never did. And so, yeah. And there's, some evidence that he was trying to conceal it, as all of these countries were during the midst of, in the middle of this, in the middle of this pandemic. I think the reason it's called the Spanish flu is because Spain was neutral during World War I, and they were the only country reporting kind of accurate numbers about how sick people were. So Woodrow Wilson was not alone, but he certainly certainly didn't do his part. So
no. And he, and if I remember correctly, he did get ill with the flu while he was there.
He definitely
in Paris.
did.
He did.
Yeah, he certainly did. So, yeah. And will be sick the next year and eventually, have a stroke. And that's another story, right?
It is. Absolutely. Well, Dr. Mitchell, I want to thank you on behalf of Chris and our audience for taking your time to join us here on the podcast today. I know I have enjoyed it. I think Chris has enjoyed it as well. I hope our audience does.
Well, yeah, it was. I had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun talking about this project and doing some research. It was a diversion of what a lot of the stuff that I do, on a day-to-day basis, and it was kind of a fun diversion for me. So I'm glad that it resonated with enough people to have a podcast about it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. As always, you can find us on Spotify, Anchor, FM, Amazon, and Facebook. We ask you to share this podcast with your family and friends. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.